What they explained to us is this. They said that people believe that when you go to school, you learn things, that you form new brain connections to bring things in. It says that's not true at all. It says children are born with too many connections. And what happens during education is a process called synaptic pruning, where your brain gets rid of connections you don't need. Because a quarter of the calories you burn per day is burned by your brain. In order to be more efficient, the fewer connections the brain has in nature, the greater your chance of survival. You will require less food to exist. So the net result of this synaptic pruning is among poor children who hear less words, their brain disconnects things, disconnects the synapses. And in disconnecting the synapses, it inhibits their future learning. Okay? When we look at pre-K, universal pre-K, turns out when we look at pre-K, this was a result released by the Obama administration, in that age, it says that universal pre-K only has a positive effect up to the third grade. And then the benefits of it are erased. And that child academically underperforms for the rest of their education. Okay? So what's the solution to that? So what's the answer to that? Well, now we have an explanation as to why there's a systemic issue in education. What's the solution? Anybody heard of Success Academies? Success Academies in New York took this science and tried to see what they could do to change it. And so what they came up with is a program of academic rigor that goes from pre-K all the way through high school. In other words, they focused on vocabulary learning rigorously. And in New York State, the graduates of the Success Academies, who are all minorities, have the highest standardized scores in the state. Right. And it's been that year over year. So in the science, we know how to fix this. It's not through racial education, it's through rigor. Peter Drucker, one of the consultants that the United States government sent over to help rebuild Japan, in the early 70s, he commissioned a study. The study, he wanted to see if he could find a way to test, have a test that would determine a person's success in life. Again, financial independence and stability of relationships. He gave aptitude tests, he gave IQ tests. Well, it turns out that some of the people with the highest IQs were homeless. And some of the people with the lowest IQs owned their own homes, had stable jobs, and were very successful. He followed a graduating class of 1,200 students over a 15-year period of time. And there was one test where everyone that was the most successful scored the highest, and everyone that was the least successful scored the lowest. What would you guess that test was?
Language skills.
It was a vocabulary test. Turns out when you know more words, you act out less impulsively. Take a 3-year-old, doesn't have a lot of words, does not express what's going on. They act out with action, often violent actions. Turns out that when we look at the criminal justice system, the same pattern exists, right? Look at the criminal justice, yeah.
That actually rings true for autistic kids, because the ones that are early done, where they talk with them and do a lot more, the behaviors in their education is very different than those that don't get that talk.
Fun fact, your brain develops from the back to the front. In the back of your head, this is what they call the phonological loop. It's the first thing that develops. The critical thinking is in the front. So when a child is not exposed to lots of words, it triggers underdevelopment in the brain. The brain starts out doing a process of extreme synaptic pruning, handicapping that child for the rest of their life unless there is an intervention to correct that.
I'd like to ask a question
Sure.
on the language part.
Yep.
This gender business of saying he or he, not mom,
Yep.
to me is really taking an advanced language and simplifying it, which to me would decrease.
It decreases it because it makes it less specific. in the sense that, yeah, when you have more words, you know the color of words, right? And you can be more precise in your expression of them, right? If you don't have precise vocabulary, where words have specific meaning, that inhibits your brain's ability to express. And you tend to start to express things with a small vocabulary in more generalized ways.
That's kind of dumbing down.
It literally dumbs it down, right? So precision is important.
Can I ask about that pre-K that catches up and then levels off at third grade, I think you said?
Yeah, falls off. If the child goes to pre-K from a poor community where their parents are undereducated, the effects are gone by the time they're in the third grade.
What about?
Because the kids' vocabularies aren't
Finish.
Because the kid still isn't hearing the words at home. So what ends up happening is the rigor, the effects of that rigor, they get out of pre-K, they start to mainstream into regular education, and they lose that. They go home, and one group of kids is being interacted with, is being verbally communicated with, and they're verbally communicating. The other child goes back home and sits in front of the television or just stares at the wall. And their brain starts to atrophy, that synaptic pruning goes apace.
Like use it or lose it.
Exactly. And the key is that if you use it younger, and it benefits you later on, there's a process called long-term potentiation. And long-term potentiation is the mechanism by which all humans actually learn. People don't learn in different ways. Everyone learns the same way. It's in biology, it's immutable, it doesn't change. All of that stuff is BS. This process called long-term potentiation is the process by which the brain takes the things that you learn and processes them. When you go to sleep, this was actually done in the late 60s, I think it was 1968, where they hooked up, they started out with mice and they did it with people. And they recorded the synaptic firing of the brain. And then they realized that when a child goes to sleep or an adult goes to sleep, it actually replays every synaptic pattern experienced during the day in 20 minutes.
Wow.
So when you're sleeping and dreaming, it's called memory consolidation. Now, when it comes to emotional learning, the memories that have association with more senses tend to be retained, right? If you're walking down through the woods and you see a lion behind that tree and it scares the crap out of you, you're always going to remember that tree. But when you're driving your car and you pass fire hydrants and trees, et cetera, your brain sees it, but it doesn't see importance to it. So it makes you forget. Your brain is actually pre-programmed to forget. The information goes into your short-term memory, and it replays at night. And when it sees something that it has seen before repetitively, your brain says, let me put a pin in that. And then when you experience it again, your brain puts a pin in it again. And then your brain, it takes about 3 nights sleep of something being repeated, your brain to say, oh, maybe I should remember that. And that's why we need homework. But not just homework, but homework that reinforces multiple days of learning, as opposed to, I'm going to do homework for what I learned today. That actually doesn't work. But if you, we tested an algorithm in Gary, Indiana, with 128 math students who were all failing. Okay, we had 67th graders and 69th graders. All we did was rearrange the homework to where 50% of their homework covered what they learned that day, 10% negative 1 day, 10% negative 2 days, 10% negative 3 days, 10% negative 4 days, and then the fifth 10% was random, so that it could exercise recall. Okay? 4 months, 98% of those students had a 2-letter grade increase in math.
Yes.
So that's just taking the science and putting it into action, and it works. Now, instinctively, our education system knew this before. Well, how do we know that? There was always songs, repetition, et cetera, in our early school, but we got away from that. Why? Because it takes a parent to make the kid do it. Right? And so as we became more time crunched, we stopped doing it. And homework became a chore. And so they said, rather than dealing with the frustration of trying to get kids to do things at home, we'll just not give them homework, or we'll give them easy homework not productive. So when you look at inner city schools, that's what's going on. Well, we have to remember this caveat. Black poverty rate averages about 20%. And what no one wants to acknowledge is that 80% of blacks are not poor.
Look at the other side, right?
So, and where we find a lot of black poverty, it is in the urban centers that were the targets of the Great Migration. Now, how did that happen? After the war, between World War I and World War II, immigration was close to zero. The world was in chaos. Immigration to the United States was not allowed. The United States, quite frankly, said, we're not going to have a bunch of refugees from Europe by the millions, or from any place else. So it was closed. That's what triggered the jobs for minorities, because the borders were closed. The industrial age came, the soldiers came back, they got jobs, but there wasn't enough labor. So blacks were drafted into work. In fact, southern states passed laws prohibiting companies from recruiting in the South because so many blacks were being recruited out of the South. 80% of the railroads that exist today in the United States were built by all black crews during the Great Migration. 80%.
That's post-World War I?
Post-World War I. So the lack of immigration had a positive effect on minority communities. In 1972, they changed the law. Now, think about this. 55% to 34.7% before the immigration law changed. And then over the next, so in that short period of time, there was a dramatic decrease in black poverty. And then they opened up the borders in 1972, and the decrease in black poverty was reduced to a third of what it had done in 9 years.
With the opening of immigration,
With
did
the
you say?
opening of immigration, two things happened. Immigration, the borders were opened up, and jobs and globalization took hold. So why were these clusters the segue to the middle class for black Americans, but all of a sudden they became enclaves of poverty? Well, look at the locations. Those industrial jobs went overseas. And then the government did something for the first time they've never done before. They gave people the ability to stay put in place. We don't have ghost towns anymore, to where the industry dries up, the copper mine dries up, and people just move to where the jobs are. Our government policies, for the first time in human history, made it possible for people to stay where there were no jobs and there were not going to be any jobs. And so people didn't move. It's the same for whites and for blacks. Look at the Appalachians. The poorest communities, the poorest white communities in the country are in Appalachia. And those towns will not move because they receive government funding to stay in locations where those coal mines will not be reopened. And so government policy creates poverty clusters.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, I'm sure that they thought they were being nice, and maybe they believed that humanity would move on, that people would get up and go and find jobs and move away. But that's not human nature. You have a house, and I give you a check to stay in your house. What are you going to do? You're going to stay in your house. And those jobs aren't coming back.
That makes sense to me, because my family, my parents' family is poor,
Look
and so
at
when
the
job
plug.
openings started up in the 60s in California, a lot of them moved to California rather than stay with
They went with the jobs. We don't do that anymore. We lose a job and go on unemployment until it runs out, and then we get some type of public assistance and we stay where we are when those jobs are coming back. But in the meantime, there are, it always mystified me when you can have an unemployment rate of quote unquote 3% or whatever it is, but then have 10 million job openings. And I was always like, wait a minute. If you have all these job openings, how come people are having problems filling the jobs? What's going on here? Shouldn't unemployment be zero? The answer is simple. The job is over here, but you're being paid to stay over here.
Being poor in place.
Increase unemployment, And it creates, and then by the effects of it, they say this is systemic racism. They blame it on racism, when racism has nothing to do with it. I'll give you another set of numbers that are startling. You know what they don't tell you is that where blacks do poorly, whites do worse academically. The graduation rate in Baltimore is a little over 73%. The graduation rate for whites in Baltimore is 72% change, and Hispanics is 54%. So we did a study. We did an exhaustive study of Virginia. In Virginia, there are 8 school districts that have a double-digit graduation rate between blacks and whites. In 4 of the school districts, blacks graduated at a higher rate than whites. Think about that. 8 school districts with a double-digit graduation gap, and blacks outperform whites half of it. In 40% of Virginia schools, blacks graduated at a higher rate than whites. 40%. Now, these are not my numbers. These numbers come from the Virginia Department of Education, and these are reports that they're required to file by law. And it'll make it hard to get the data. Literally, we had to go 6 weeks through long spreadsheets to pull out all these numbers. We had to download raw data from the Virginia VBOE and look at the data. And it turned out, and quite frankly, employees of the NSABA, there were some black employees that were angry because they felt that they'd been lied to. So we said, maybe this is just Virginia. So we checked Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. There's only 2 school systems where blacks do poorly and whites don't do worse. And that's Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, Georgia. Los Angeles, whites underperform blacks. Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, same pattern.
That's it. We're there. Record.
Where's the racism? So what they do is they first talk about Jim Crow and slavery, and they talk about blacks, and they give you a number that's lower because they include Hispanics. Now, Hispanic performance is about 20 points below whites and blacks. So what's the problem there? Language. Poor immigrants tend to have low vocabularies, and it gives them the inability to perform well. Now, when you go through the regular immigration system, if you have an educated person who has a strong vocabulary in Spanish, you know that person outperforms whites. So it's not even specifically English. It's the size of the vocabulary of the person and whatever language they were raised in.
Most of them will learn 2 languages.
Right. So that whole thing about the phonological loop, that whole thing about that kid is not suffering through extreme synaptic pruning, even though it's a different language. But when you mix that number in, you get this thing called people of color underperforming, and it hides what's actually going on. And rather than looking at the idea of how rigor can correct this, because in the Success Academies in New York, there are Hispanic and black kids that are outperforming the state with academic vocabulary rigor. In fact, their reading program is so strong, they found in studies that math scores went up 25% as they built stronger vocabulary. So we have the science to address this.
Now, isn't it, because most of the reasons I feel like that is by design, so defeat the belly of big government, courts, prisons, social workers, all of that, if you keep people at a certain level.
Yes.
No.
The situation we have in public education, imagine if we had one town. Imagine you had one town and there was one mechanic shop. And you brought your car to that shop and they fixed some stuff and broke some stuff. Right? And you get your car and something's wrong. You take it back to the shop and they fixed some stuff and they broke some stuff. Right? What choice would you have? There's only one mechanic shop in town.
Exactly right.
Right? What are our school systems? We have a system where we have one mechanic shop. And they fix some things, they break some things. And what does the mechanic tell you? It's how you're driving the car. You lean off the brakes or the brakes with it. You know, these bad mechanics have every excuse for why your car is broken.
And they'll say, where else are you gonna go?
In the studying, and I just want to say, you've given us a little bit of a rehash of child growth and development, and I appreciate that a great deal, being a former education student. But in the research, has anybody found a way to reverse the synaptic pruning?
Yep.
Can you talk about that?
Rigorous building of vocabulary from kindergarten through 12th grade, never letting up on it. Never letting up on the rigor.
How about afterwards?
Never letting, well, as an adult, right?
I'm talking about
Okay,
after 18 years old.
So as an adult,
To the individual.
the education process is not what you learn. The education process is learning the process of learning, right? You're only gonna remember 15% of everything you learn in K through 12 in college. 15%, you're not gonna remember most of it, okay?
That's ridiculous.
So what's the benefit of it? The benefit of it is that in that process, you're there to learn how to learn. All learners are self-learners, right? And if you never get into a habit of self-learning as an adult, you'll suffer from that. And we know this. Simple things. For example, they find that in Alzheimer's studies that people that listen to lots of different kinds of music and go to different restaurants don't tend to suffer from it. But people who in their adult lives become so simplified in their routine, they listen to the same music, go to the same restaurants, eat the same foods, that their risk of Alzheimer's goes up 300%.
Wow.
Why? Because your brain is still pruning. You're not using cells. So your brain just goes, hey, I have these 10 cells that I use all the time. We don't need the rest of them. And it starts to tear them down. In Alzheimer's study, there are therapies out there that actually just have people, you're gonna eat Mexican, go eat Chinese, do some Italian, cook some food that's a little different. Oh, you like country music, listen to a little rock and roll, listen to some classical music. Do this, go out and travel, see some things, do some different sites. Don't drive the same way home every day. You know, go off the beaten path every now and then. Diversify your experiences and your brain stays healthy.
Get rid of those chapters.
Right. And when you look at a book, if you're reading people get into reading the same kinds of books thinking, well, I read. No, you don't. You're reading the same thing over and over again at the same vocabulary level, and you're not challenging yourself. So it has a negative effect on the brain. It's just the way it is.
How does opportunity come in play? Is there any?
In terms of, well, okay, so this is an example I give of that. Capitalism isn't broken. Capitalism is that big highway that flows through the country. We have problems with on-ramps, okay? We have problems where some neighborhoods have better on-ramps than other neighborhoods. And I'll give you an example. These are some legislative proposals that I've been advocating to look at just that. We want to solve the problem. We need to deal with the idea of opportunity, how to take advantage of opportunity. On the school side, there's some things we can do, right? We can change the system. First thing I advocate for is getting rid of the one mechanic shop in town paradigm. And I've talked to Glenn about this. I've talked to legislators about this. Glenn Young. And I don't know if in the beginning he talked about school vouchers a lot. And he stopped talking about school vouchers. He started talking about charter schools because I convinced him that vouchers would be bad. Vouchers would be bad because when the government gives you money, eventually they attach strings, and then you give the government power over private schools. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you have 180,000 students in the Fairfax County school system, well, what if 80,000 of them want to take their vouchers and go to another school?
Yes.
There aren't 80,000 alternative seats. So you only have about 3 to 5% of Americans with vouchers. And then on top of that, if you go to Petersburg and to poor communities, where transportation is much more limited, and those who are working poor are working 1 and 2 jobs, they don't have the time to get their kid and drive them to an alternative school. They're dependent on the school bus, and they're dependent on, or their child being able to walk to the school, right? So it can't work. There's a piece of legislation that was put up, and I'm going to talk to the sponsor where he talked about, education savings accounts. It's gonna be debated in the House in this session. And while that sounds good, that was to get around the idea of the government giving you money so that they can attach strings to. But it's still the same problem. You get an education savings account, where's the kid gonna go? It takes what? It takes 4 years to open up a private school.
Yes.
Well, one thing they could do is right here, if they pay $15,000 or $16,000 a year to the college.
Well, that would benefit.
Yeah,
That would benefit.
yeah.
Virginia should move towards a model of 80 to 100% charter schools, where the government operates the infrastructure so the kid can still walk to school and still take the bus. And then every 48 years, there's an evaluation done, and the operators of the best charter schools take over the operations of the worst charter schools.
How do you get around the school boards?
Well, they would lose power.
They would have to be, they would have to have it poured from.
This would destroy teachers' unions, and it would destroy school boards. The school board would become caretakers for infrastructure,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Because the academics would be in private hands, the teachers' unions would have no power at all. And because all of the, so you put choice in that type of a situation, now the power rests in who can produce the best results, and not in a school board or a superintendent.
How do you take, you've got 100 schools in the state of Virginia.
Yeah.
How do you take 80 of them and define them as charter schools?
What you
Define
do-
charter schools for me.
Okay, so a charter school will be a school independently operated by a private concern who will be in charge of all of the academics. In other words, what's taught, schedules, that kind of thing. As far as the lights being on, the heat being turned on, the bus schedules, all of that will still be provided by the state. The way you get there is you do it in phases. The first thing is you identify what I would call education opportunity zones. Look at those school systems at the bottom of the barrel, and over a 6 to 10 year period of time, you migrate them into being a charter school. Right, so you're starting with the least performing schools. And from that, you're gonna get a result in about 4 years that you're gonna be able to see if there's improvement. Over that time period, then you identify the next tier. So start from the bottom up, you identify the next tier, and you roll the charter program of that. It takes about 20 years to fully do it. It's not something that happens overnight. But if you roll it up that way, and you have that competitiveness between private school operators, I think you'll see better outcomes.
So at the same time, the upper tier schools that are existing are going to watch what's happening here and up their game to stay on top of it.
Because you can even allow the school districts to be operators of the school, but they are at the same standard. They have to be successful at it. So a school district who operates that school will see the bear chasing them down. And if they want to remain in control of that school, then they have to have better outcomes.
Yeah, okay.
Back to the quote.
One of the concerns that I have is class size in the public schools.
Yep.
Because when you have 20, and I've done
Yeah.
early intervention, Department of Defense Child Development Programs, so I have kind of a background in
Yep.
that. But when you have 28 children in first grade class, they're not getting that one-on-one that they need, the individual education plan. So, if we could reduce class sizes in our schools, put more into the classroom instead of into the superintendents and the school boards and all that.
There are too many administrators, right? I think something like 40% of the school staff is administrators. But there's another answer to that. What takes up most of the teacher's time is assessment, right? Assessment takes up 60 to 70% of the teacher's time, and they're only teaching about 30% of the time, right? We have AI and technology that can reduce that. So you don't use technology for teaching. I know this works because I built the system and tested it, and it works. It works because imagine if teachers didn't have to spend all that time grading papers. Take all that time with assessment away. Take away an automated assessment. A, could tell the student where a student is, and then use technology to enable what we call wave education. So what we have now is called waterfall education, right? Waterfall education is teach, quiz, teach, quiz, test. And it flows in one direction and never goes backwards. So if a kid misses something, there's a thing called a cumulative learning deficit. And I'm gonna give you a complicated answer, right? I did a paper back in 2007 for the State Department, and I was tasked with coming up of a way with reforming, with creating new school systems in countries that had gone through a civil war. And they had brought over a group of American educators to rebuild the school system, and they were failing at it. Because there were some assumptions that came with that, right? Teacher qualifications were such that you weren't gonna find that in these countries. I had schools in Liberia and Sierra Leone where I might have 20 students one day and 100 the next. Where there were so many students that literally they had to be taken outside and taught sitting on the streets, right? And so it was a complicated situation. So there were a couple of outcomes. So I was tasked to study kind of how public education works in the United States and tell them why they were failing. And it came up with a couple of things. The first thing was the grading system, okay? Our grading system is designed for the Industrial Revolution, okay? So that it was designed to provide enough literacy to build a car or build a house or do something like that. There was no emphasis on critical thinking or anything like that. It was, can you read instructions and can you follow them?
Manual.
Right? That's what it's designed. So our grading system is the same way, but what they don't realize is that if you have a grading system that's, that's through A, if a child passes the 6th grade with a C in math, that means that they went to the 7th grade not knowing 25% at least of what they should know. And then they take that deficit, 7th grade, and maybe they get a C in the 7th grade, and they go to 8th grade, and over time, that deficit accumulates, so that you get seniors who don't think they're good at math. Well, that's not true. Everybody's a math genius. No, I can prove it. Okay, how many of you are repeatedly run over by cars? How many? You're not, how many when they get in their car run into trees and other cars on a regular basis?
Kenny does every day.
Well, it's only been in the last 10 years that we can create computers that can do that. And our self-driving cars still haven't gotten it done.
There you go.
But in a fraction of a second, your brain looks at an object, calculates its speed and distance as it moves towards you, and adjusts your body, your speed and distance, so that the two of you don't collide. And you do that in a fraction of a second. You are a math genius, because we can't get computers to do that. Right? So that being said, the issue is these cumulative knowledge deficits, learning deficits, and the fact that we don't have repetitiveness in terms of how we learn math. You weren't a 6-year-old and went onto a highway and walked across the street perfectly. You kind of stood on the side of the street, you kind of looked, and first it's really far away, and you took your chance, you went across, and then the next time the car's a little bit closer. Maybe the first time you ran across the street when it was a mile away, and all of a sudden you've gotten to the point to where you can walk across the street with confidence that you're not going to get run over.
Yeah.
And that was through repetition, right? Through repetition where you could feel it. I homeschool my oldest kids. My son Brandon wanted to go and play football in high school. So 10th grade goes to Myers High School. I get a call about a month after that, they tell me that my son is cheating. I'm like, well, what he says is, well, he writes down the answers to his math problems, but he doesn't show his work. So he must be getting it somewhere, right? So I said, go ahead and test him. So they sat him down with the algebra book, and they had him go through the book. He went through the book, took him about 2 weeks, he got the answers, he never wrote down his work. Half the time he didn't know how to use the answers, just kind of looked at it, and he could almost feel the math. Because he'd been doing it so much in homeschool that he didn't have to. there's another little piece, I've done a lot of work in education reform. One of the things that I did in terms of this idea of repetition over days, over time period, when a child is wrestling with the operation, the mathematical operation, as they are learning a new concept, 30% of their attention is trying to solve the math problem in their head. So if a teacher's teaching quadratic equations, and they say 9 times 6, now the teacher's just giving an example, but the natural human instinct is to start trying to solve 9 times 6. They're not fully paying attention. When you get a bunch of kids in class that haven't mastered the fundamentals, they are not listening even when they're listening.
That would be the memorization of the time.
Right.
Because when I get the numbers, you see the answer, I see the whole.
You have to have it pop into your head. So what I did with my kids, I gave them, they had to know 0 through 12 times tables, and they had a quarter of a second to answer it. And they had to have 5 perfect scores in these tests until they could move on. So that when I taught them a more advanced math concept, they weren't worried about the mathematical operations. They knew what the multiplication was. It was there, right? You know, imagine if you had a surgeon who's operating on you, and that surgeon decided they need to open up the book and check it in the middle of an operation, right? That'd be pretty sketchy, right? So it's the same thing. They have to do things enough so that it becomes second nature, and then you build knowledge on top of that. If you start to build the knowledge before you do that, you're going to have a problem, and that's part of the problem we're seeing in public education, I think.
India, parents from India,
Mm-hmm.
that's, yeah, they drill
Yep.
in math, so that when you see them up there, that's why they,
Yep,
because everything is, yeah.
and they're paying attention to how to do the more complicated operations. They're not wrestling with basic operations. They're not figuring, do I multiply that first and then add that? They got that part figured out.
Just a personal experience, when I was in high school, I took algebra split into two years. Well, I was doing so well in the first year, they just pumped me up to algebra 1, right? So I decided to take algebra 2 and trigonometry. Well, I flunked it. So the second semester I dropped out. I didn't want that on my record. So the next year, I redid it. I went back to algebra 2 and I aced the first semester. I got an A. Second semester, I flunked it. So the point was, I had absorbed what I got in the first year, or in the first thing of algebra 2, but it took me longer. You know, I needed that learning curve or whatever it was.
You needed time to consolidate your memory.
Exactly.
So that it was part of it. The hippocampus does this. It consolidates the hippocampus, and then it maps it out in your synapses.
But I amazed
and
myself.
And you can reuse it over and over again.
Well, that's, proven fact of that is that the brain is extremely resilient. When you have somebody that's had a stroke,
Yeah.
and the repetitive training that they have to do to regain speech or physical movement and things like that. So I believe, and I've seen it happen, that even adults can learn more
They can.
through repetition.
You look through repetition because it allows you to remap other synapses to do the same thing. And the thing about your education is that once you have synapses in place, your brain actually does, they're not fixed. Your brain can reuse those synapses for something else, which is why when you have a program of rigor that is long-standing in your early childhood, when you get to high school, everything is easier. It's because your brain is using existing pathways, and it can replicate more complicated synaptic patterns in your head because they've been preserved. If they have not been preserved, then you have to go through a complex thing called long-term potentiation, and long-term potentiation creates new synapses, but it takes a lot of energy to do it. There's a reason why you realize you only learn when you're asleep.
Yeah.
It takes too much energy. This is called neuroplasticity. It takes too much energy to reshape the brain when you learn something new. And you can't do it while you're awake. You only do it when you're asleep. So when you're going to sleep and these patterns are that's when the brain starts to say, okay, I need 10 synapses and I have 5. And then it starts to build and it builds weak connections. And then with repetitions, it gets stronger and stronger.
So we got files in our head?
Real quick, one of the things I learned at Caldwell University from the neurology department there, they actually weren't there to study education. They were there to study teen addiction. And I came and I said, well, how do you know what's wrong with the brain if you haven't mapped what's right with the brain? So I said, give me your data on the healthy brain. And I can look at that and use that and apply that to academic learning. And when I look at that, some of the conclusions. Did you know being a good student, the same thing that takes everything to your brain is an addiction, right? And everything in your brain is a positive synapse connection. You actually have neurological connections that make you lazy. And when you try not to be lazy, your brain has to disconnect those synapses and recreate new ones. When someone's addicted, their brain creates synapses for the addiction. And the reason why it's so hard to break an addiction is that it has to tear apart those synapses that were patterned for that addiction to create other ones. So when you're trying to go from being a bad student to a good student, you have withdrawal.
Wow.
Just like a drug addict. You don't want to do it, your brain plays those games with you. You have this tendency to go back to the old habit over and over again. And in some instances, it's painful. Have you ever tried to change a habit, how hard it is? That's because you form synapses for the bad habit. And your brain, it's called long-term depression. Your brain has to use a process called long-term depression to destroy the synapses that you created for the bad habit or for the thing that you don't want to do. And it has to create new ones. So it's not just you're creating new ones, you're destroying old ones and creating new ones. And that's why it's so hard.
Yeah, we're all filled with questions. We love what you're talking about, and we're dragging you away from the policy issues that you want to talk about.
And I was going to jump back to that.
Well, I hope you might be able to address a couple of policy issues. One of them is there are lots of universities in Virginia.
Yep.
They have education departments. They could be very important in forming new charter schools. That's one thing.
Yep.
And the other thing, sir, yeah, well, that's what I want you to. The other thing is, believe it or not, the environmental equity question is pretty important, because if you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have trees and doesn't have sidewalks and is crowded and dirty, you don't have a lot of resale value for your property, and you don't have a lot of tax dollars going to the public school system. And this is one reason why public schools fail in downtrodden neighborhoods. Those are two issues that I thought you might want to talk about.
So it's not the reason why they fail in downtrodden neighborhoods, okay? How can I say this? There is no such thing as a failing school, right? There's only such thing as a failing neighborhood that's composed of failed families. Okay?
Yes, I believe that.
You don't have situations where you have, because we can look out, there are poor neighborhoods that are black and white. There are poor neighborhoods that were black and white before the Civil Rights Act. And they did quite well. If you think about this, with 90% poverty among blacks, well, at the end of the Civil War, poverty among blacks was about 100%. Now people say, no, that's not true. Well, there's about 3% of blacks that had some wealth. So it was close to 100%. Yet, 100 years later, it was cut almost in half. And these are people who didn't have all these tools that we blame. You know, the school doesn't have air conditioning, or there's not enough that exists, right? So we lifted ourselves up without those things, right? We look at pioneers that went out and built log cabins and had one-room schoolhouses. None of these things that we depend upon had anything to do with building this country. We built it without all of those things, right? Now, those processes, there are some systemic issues there's some systemic issues in poverty clusters that need to be addressed. And these are policy positions that, actually, before COVID, I was negotiating with the Trump administration to try to come up with to get him to embrace some of these policies. Friend of mine, Mrs. Childs, Andrew Childs, her sister is one of the news anchors at Newsmax. She was in the Fox and Friends show as guest host for about 2 years. And Donald Trump Jr. was on her speed dial. So she connected me up and we had these discussions. And looking at the data, right? Poor people don't tend to have good credit. And they don't have good credit because good credit is built borrowing money you don't need. Right? And with all the money that you have, you need to live, you don't have the opportunity to build credit. Right? So that locks you out of a lot of very large purchases. So one of the programs that I've spoken about is a federal bill pay system, to where you enter to the program and you pay in your rent, your utilities, etc. And then after a period of time, 36 months or 48 months of regular payments, that got you a federal guarantee on the house. But the house that you bought, you had to buy it in the community. Right? Because what happens? I had a discussion with them about enterprise zones. I said enterprise zones, though they sound good, they're idiotic.
They don't work.
Because what happens? You displace poverty. You have the person that has the capital come in and invest in the community, and you price the people out. Right? Princeton, New Jersey had a poor section. You know how they got the city to be rich? They changed the way the taxes were. They passed laws to limit the number of people that could be in the house. So the schools improved because half the families with more than 2 kids were pushed out. So class sizes went down.
Okay.
And the people the poor people, they just got they were just shuffling the deck. Same thing when they talk about Giuliani in New York. He didn't create wealth for people. He shuffled the deck so that it made it good for wealthier people to move in and displace the poor people. And those people went to places like Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, Scranton, et cetera, and in towns that were small towns that had no crime and no drugs. Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania had the highest per capita murder rate in Pennsylvania. When I was in school, we were on the cover of Time magazine as one of the 7th safest places to live.
So this was the influx of people displaced by
They're all
gentrification.
fulfilled. We had a woman opened up a beauty salon. The Salvation Army opened up a drug treatment center in Wilkes-Barre under the logic that there was no drug trade there, and that you could rehab people and release them into Wilkes-Barre, and they would have an opportunity to become re-addicted. Well, those people decided that these were new customers, and they went back to the city and got drug connections. This woman, her house was built by Habitat for Humanity. She got a small business loan to open up a beauty salon. It was a front for a heroin operation. And so Wilkes-Barre suffers terribly from heroin addiction now. Oh yeah. We have there are shootings almost every night there now. And this was the 7th safest city in America. We're not good at getting rid of poverty. We're good at shuffling the deck. And that's just the way it is. We tend not to, we don't go in and have these enterprise zones in these black communities, and the people in the community end up being the beneficiaries of them. We just move them out to someplace else. And then when you go, oh my gosh, this community is uplifted. Look at that. Look at them. Those aren't the same people that were there. And that's a policy problem. So a federal bill pay system will allow people to develop alternative credit. You know, an example, my brother Charles, a command sergeant major in the Army, retired, went to buy a house and had a hard time finding a mortgage because he never used credit. He had $100,000 in his checking account. But $100,000 in his checking account, they wouldn't give him a loan.
Wow.
He ended up having to find a private lender. He put like $30,000 down, $100,000 house. This is a Wilkes-Barre, so I know the system doesn't count that much. And he finally got a mortgage, right? And I can tell you, most of my family, none of them use credit at all. They don't. They just collect. They don't use it. Why? Because credit is spending money you don't need, so that when you do need it, you have credit sort of get it.
So
Right,
you have a bill that you want to introduce to Congress
There's a
at the
Senate.
federal level, okay?
Yep.
And you're gonna tell us all about it,
Well, let's
especially
do
that
state
guy
first.
sitting over there.
That's
Yeah.
it. So I lead a coalition that we're pushing legislation in Virginia now, and I've been working on this since the election was over. The first bill, or two bills, so I've been in contact with Delegate McGuire. He's going to be the patient for the anti-CRT bill. We crafted a bill. Actually, we started out in the special budget session in October. His office, Senator Newman's office reached out to me because of my work and asked me to write a bill that was anti-CRT. And I said, well, you can't say CRT in it.
Right.
What you have to do is you have to identify the core tenets, such as you can't teach that America is systemically racist, you can't teach that, there's certain things you could teach, and it's a list of about 6 things. And then there's another piece of legislation that passed in February, in the dark of night, a special session of education on cultural competency that mandated that teachers basically learn CRT principles and apply them in the classroom. So the 2 bills that I put forward was to, it doesn't repeal cultural competency, it changes the word shall to may. And the reason for that is, in politics, when a politician votes to pass a bill, they will not vote to rescind it, right? So the amendment is kind of in my underhanded way of saying, you're not rescinding it, you're making it optional.
Just to get support, to get support.
Right, so that the school, because we're 2 votes down in the Senate, right? The House is a slam dunk, right? The language is there. I've been working with McGuire, Amy Batten first sent my bill to Legislative Services to get the language crafted, but she's on the Education Committee. McGuire is the Education Subcommittee, so he's become the patron. He merged the 2 because it's part of the same title under Virginia Code into 1. And what it does is it bans the core tenets of CRT. It cannot be taught to teachers or students, or be included in any curriculum, be it optional or third party, right? That's the first piece that it does. And then on cultural competency, it changes the shall to a may and makes it optional. Now I have the votes on the floor to pass them both, to pass it. But I don't have the votes in the Senate Education Committee to get it out of committee. So that's what I'm working on now.
Good luck.
Right? And it's all been pre-screened. I put the legislation together. Glenn Youngkin and I are personal friends. I ran it by him. He's signed off on the language. It goes to his desk, no question. He'll sign it. So that's the anti-CRT bill, right? So that's in place, and I'll share the language of it. We have a website for it called colorblindforlife.org.
I believe Diana gave it to us.
Yeah.
I read it before I came.
And the language of the bill is there. So that's the first bill that we're pushing through, but I'm also working with Glenn Davis and others on bills for the second session. The bill for the second session, this is a modification to the bill that allows superintendents to hide crimes in schools from law enforcement. So we'll be dealing with that. So those are 2 major pieces of legislation that I'm working on.
And Glenn Davis is helping you with that?
He's told me to do it.
All right.
The other piece of there's that piece of legislation at the state level. The other piece is Amy Goodera, all the bad press that she's had out there. I'm on the phone with her every single day, and the governor connected she and I and asked me to work with her.
Very good.
In terms of helping her to root out CRT in Virginia government. So we put together 2 documents. The first document is called Line of Authority. And the Line of Authority document is basically, I pulled in some lawyers, and we went through Virginia code to identify everything that the governor can do through executive authority and through appointment to root out CRT within the government. So that's her roadmap. That's going to be her roadmap. That document will be finalized a week from tomorrow. And we have a second document. The second document, we're doing a couple things. we have that. I have a team that's looking through all of the VBOE websites, and the idea is to purge any references to CRT, period. All resources, all links. Our goal is by next summer that there's none of this equity CRT stuff in any public-facing website within the Virginia government.
And no private trainers coming in?
No private trainers. Understand, if we pass the legislation on CRT, that cuts out the private trainers and it undermines all of, see, there's some statutes in place. There's a statute that mandates like equity and inclusion training, right? So that's a legislative initiative that we have to do that we can't pass right now because we don't have the Senate, okay? So what we're doing in that, we also have another document called the Glossary, it's a Glossary of Definitions. And because the word equity is in so many places and it's by statute, it turns out that in the statute, it never defines it. So we're going to define it by policy. And equity is going to come to mean a neutral education system that does not take into account identity. We're going to redefine inclusion as inclusion of ideas and points of views. And so we're going through terms. I work with familyfoundation.org. Todd over there, I've tasked him to put a team together to scour through and give me a list of terms, and we're going to redefine them to mean something else. Right? And then the next piece of that is all of the high-level policy statements that have been issued through VBOE from superintendent, et cetera. We're going to wash out those policy statements. So he has a team that's working to rewrite all of these policy directives.
For all the different school systems?
At the state level. Yeah. So that when it pushes down, so the legal mandate still exists, but it will mean something else by the time it gets into their hands.
And I'm sorry, but I want to hear what your objection is to university education system.
My objection to university education system, that's a federal problem, not a state problem. What do I mean by that? Title IX funding and other such funding, the funding that's been put to universities have strings attached that mandate certain things for higher education. The reason why I'm against vouchers and giving a segue into private K through 12 schools is because the federal government uses federal funding to control what private universities teach and don't teach. One of the reasons why I'm running for Congress is to try to fundamentally change the U.S. Department of Education to where their incentive funds goes towards charter and goes towards these new definitions of equity and inclusion. Once the strings are changed, then I think we'll see, put it this way, they're decadent capitalists. The people in college, they're not doing this because they're ideologues. They're doing this because they're getting paid. It's just the way it is. And if you pay them for something else, they're going to do something else. Now, I'm going to say this. Realize that IRS code only has 3% of the IRS code talks about the taxes that you pay. 97% of the IRS code is how to get out of taxes. The federal government uses tax deductions to control behavior. And when you do what they want you to do, you don't pay the tax. Right? That's the way the government exercises policy. Because they don't have direct constitutional authority to do these things. So they attach a regulation to money. You can get these colleges to jump around on one leg and pat their bellies all day long if you give them enough cash.
That's for sure.
Right? So for higher education, we have to incentivize. We have to incentivize them at the financial level, and that means that we need hearings, public hearings, into the inner workings of the U.S. Department of Education and the strings that attach to their funds. Because when the funds are passed by Congress, these strings were not there. And I assert that's a violation of constitutional authority and separation of powers.
You're right.
And that's what we have to, that's what we have to kind of push into. And then, go for it.
No, I was gonna say, can Tamara be the last question because we're we're out of time.
Last question needs to be over there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just wanted to touch on the policy, you said some of the blue pots and the pods, you
Yeah.
talked about some of the data using the logic not being accurate. So how do we correct that? So if there you have all the issues that are based on incorrect information as you discussed,
Yeah.
how do we correct that?
A, put the data out there and make sure the public gets the data, so that when the public, most people believe that racism is the boogeyman, right? The boogeyman, critical race theory is a science built around the boogeyman, right? Your kid sees a shadow, and the kid says, oh my gosh, it's a monster, right? Now, critical race theory, when the parent comes in and goes, you know, it is a monster. So they turn on the light, and the shadow goes away, and they come with an explanation, well, that's the boogeyman's ghosting. And they have a whole science built around something that doesn't exist. They created a vocabulary to describe fiction, right? And I always say, you know, you watch a movie, draws you in, you have all the emotions, you cry when the hero dies, but guess what? It ain't real. And that's the issue that we have here. So the public needs to be more educated about the data. Because I'll tell you, I've done dozens and dozens of these speeches, and 90% of them people go, I didn't know that. They had a default acceptance of the presence of racism where it did not exist. Because they never give us the facts. They give us the conclusions. They give us the inferences and all that stuff. So,
And they get to make that up.
right, we have to educate them. There are policies at the federal level that we can do to address some of these things, specifically when it comes to poverty, specifically when it comes to education. At the state level, I think if we can get traction on the universal charter school idea, I think it'll go a big way into dispelling some of this. And the other critical thing is you cannot just get rid of critical race theory. You have to replace it with a positive ideology.
Yes, sir.
Otherwise, the next administration comes out and just picks up where they left off. That's why we want to redefine the terms. That's why we want to talk about rigor. That's why we want to expose the data underneath underperformance and address it for the problem that it is. And don't just get rid of CRT training. Come up with training that is based on rigor and facts.
Okay.
I bought a whole box of business cards.
Okay.
And I respond within a week to anybody. I get hundreds of calls a week. I will post as much information online. If you go to my candidate site, www.paulaftercongress.org, that actually goes through the root causes in terms of poverty. It goes through the Great Migration. It's a great summary that's on there that talks specifically about it. Talks specifically about how it affects criminal justice, yada, 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 yada. The NSABA.org site, that one has the Virginia studies on there that has all the raw data about it that's posted there. And then any other questions, you just give me a call or invite me back.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great, yeah. And you're running it. Great. Okay, so we do a brief business meeting and then we'll do announcements. So do we have a quorum? Yeah. Okay, so the minutes were in the newsletter and on the website. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes?
I motion that we approve the minutes.
Okay, all those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, let me get the...
And that concludes tonight's broadcast.